The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest stories in human history, predating the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Bible. It tells the tale of a king who confronts monstrous creatures, enters the world of the dead, and returns, possibly with the key to immortality, though not in the way he initially conceived. The story is simultaneously an epic adventure, a mythological legend, and a profound reflection on the limits of the human condition. In this video, we will explore the content of the Epic of Gilgamesh in detail. Hello curious minds, and welcome back to Deciphering Stories. I'm your host Luca Schultz, and today we're going to delve a little deeper into Sumerian tales, specifically the Epic of Gilgamesh. But before we embark on this journey of discovery, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stay with me until the end of this video, and you'll be amazed by the fantastic story of this imposing king who challenged even the gods to achieve his goals. Without further ado, let's go to the video. Before delving into the central theme, let us contextualize the origin of this story of the king of Uruk. According to the records of kings preserved in ancient Sumer, Gilgamesh was the fifth monarch of the post-diluvial era, ruling for 126 years in the city of Uruk, in present-day Iraq. These records indicate that he supervised the construction of the city walls and established the stability necessary for its flourishing, elevating it to one of the main centers of power in the ancient world. Some scholars suggest the possibility that this king may have existed between the 11th and 7th centuries BC. However, this does not necessarily imply that historians endorse the idea of a literal 126-year reign or the conception of Gilgamesh as a giant or demigod, attributes also associated with him in Sumerian records. It is more plausible that the considerable fame achieved by Gilgamesh during his lifetime fueled various legends surrounding his figure. After his death, some later traditions completely deified him, treating him as a god worthy of all the rights and honors reserved for the other gods. In any case, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the main one among these epic and mythological poems written about the king of Uruk. The classical version of the epic, which we will discuss shortly, dates back to the 14th or 13th century BC, but it recounts stories that had already been circulating in writing in Mesopotamia since at least the 22nd century BC. In other words, these stories are older in relation to the Christian era than the Christian era is to us today. In total, this classical version consists of 12 clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, which can be essentially divided into three parts. A first part full of great deeds and adventures, a second part darker, in which Gilgamesh descends to the world of the dead and hears the story of the Great Flood, and a third part, brief but deeply enigmatic and well-positioned. With this context established, we can now enter the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh itself and examine what is transmitted in its 12 tablets. The first part of the poem begins with a kind of praise to King Gilgamesh, portrayed as a being two-thirds divine and one-third human. Due to this divine ancestry, Gilgamesh is gigantic and extremely powerful. On the one hand, this benefits his subjects as they have a strong leader to ensure the protection of the kingdom. On the other hand, it is detrimental because with nothing being a challenge for Gilgamesh, he often gets bored and, on these occasions, disturbs the population of Uruk. He randomly provokes fights with young men on the street and always demands the first night with all the women who marry in the city before their husbands. Due to these abuses, one day the people start to cry out to the gods to resolve the situation, and the gods respond as follows. The goddess Aruru, creator of humanity at the beginning of time, molds a man out of clay and places him in a field near the walls of Uruk. There he spends his days living with the animals, as if he were one of them. The hunters of the region start to get upset with his presence as he starts to disarm the traps that the hunters set to catch the animals. So they go to King Gilgamesh to ask for his intervention to remove the wild man from there. Gilgamesh focuses his attention on this problem and keeps the population in peace, at least temporarily. And what is Gilgamesh's strategy for dealing with the wild man? He sends a temple priestess to the place where the man used to stay and instructs her to lure the man to the city. When the man sees the priestess, he becomes interested, and the two join for 7 days and 7 nights. After this period, the priestess teaches him some customs of civilized life, such as eating and drinking beer. From that moment on, the man ceases to be truly wild. In a way, he distances himself from nature, and even the animals start to flee from him. The text mentions that he loses his purity but gains knowledge and wisdom. Finally, the priestess leads him to the city as planned, where he meets Gilgamesh. The moment of their encounter is a bit complicated. There is a wedding happening in the city, and Gilgamesh intervenes so that the bride can sleep with him before the wedding is consummated. The man, seeing this, questions him, and the two immediately start measuring their strength and engage in a brutal fight in the middle of the street, destroying everything around them. Gilgamesh wins this fight by a very narrow margin, but instead of becoming enemies after this hostile encounter, the opposite happens and the two become inseparable companions from that moment on. Finally, Gilgamesh found someone who rivaled him, someone he admired, and who also managed to mitigate his boredom, capturing his attention enough to leave the population of Uruk in peace. Until then, the divine design seemed to be unfolding as planned. However, this harmony would not last long. From this point on, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the name of the wild man, decide to undertake great feats together. The first of these feats is an expedition against Humbaba, a terrible creature that inhabited the cedar forest, possibly an allusion to Lebanon, described in the text as a monster that exhaled fire and death. After a long journey, Gilgamesh and Enkidu reach the creature's lair and attack it abruptly. They decapitate it and tear out its lungs, returning to the city of Uruk with these trophies. The goddess Ishtar, responsible for sex and violence, is impressed by this brutal feat and proposes marriage to Gilgamesh. However, aware of the tragic fate of Ishtar's husbands, Gilgamesh refuses the request. Ishtar, a goddess, is deeply enraged by the refusal of a mortal. She then appeals to her father, Anu, the god of the sky, asking him to send the Bull of Heaven, an extraordinarily powerful creature, to destroy Gilgamesh's kingdom in Uruk. If Anu refuses to do this, Ishtar threatens to go down to the world of the dead, break down the gates that separate the living from the dead, and cause the dead to rise up and devour the living. Faced with this threat, Anu agrees to send the Bull of Heaven to Uruk. However, Gilgamesh and Enkidu manage to defeat this mythical creature as well. After the victory, Enkidu mocks Ishtar, tearing off one of the bull's legs and throwing it in her direction, suggesting that she also deserved that wicked fate. In short, the gods' initial plan to stop Gilgamesh by creating another powerful entity to challenge and distract him completely spiraled out of control. Shortly after the union of the legendary Gilgamesh and Enkidu, two ancient beings were annihilated. The guardian Humbaba, a creature precious to the god Enlil, and the celestial bull, belonging to the god Anu. Concerned about the disruption of the cosmic order, the gods devised a cruel plan. One of the heroes had to die. The coexistence of the two was seen as a threat to the harmony of the universe. Enkidu was chosen for the sacrifice. A relentless plague consumed his strength, silencing the warrior who once challenged the gods and killed monsters. In a few days, the once vibrant and powerful man was reduced to dust. The death of Enkidu deeply shook Gilgamesh. The hero, immersed in grief, questioned the fragility of life and the cruelty of fate. The loss of his friend and companion in adventures left him adrift, seeking answers in the midst of pain and uncertainty. The death of Enkidu marks the beginning of the second stage of the story, where Gilgamesh sinks into a sea of inconsolable grief. Days drag on in tears over his friend's body until nature itself intervenes, with a worm emerging from Enkidu's nose as a poignant symbol of the irreversible transformation of life. After the burial and funeral rites, Gilgamesh remains dejected, wandering aimlessly. Wearing lion skins as a symbol of mourning, he carries the weight of loss and the harsh reality of mortality. The strength, vitality and life that once seemed eternal, now reveal themselves to be ephemeral. The loss of Enkidu not only robs Gilgamesh of his best friend, but also confronts him with the fragility of his own existence. This harsh reality drives him to seek a solution to the problem of death, embarking on a journey in search of immortality. He was aware from the ancient stories that at least one person on Earth had achieved the state of immortality. Thus, he decided to seek out this person to inquire how he could also reach such a state. The problem was that this person, paradoxically, this immortal being, resided precisely in the world of the dead, or at least on the margins of that world, on the banks of the river of death. To reach this place, Gilgamesh needed to climb the mountains of Shamash, the sun god, and find the Scorpion Man, the guardian of these mountains that separate the world of the living from the world of the dead. Shamash, the sun god, is the lord of this journey. After all, he travels it daily, from dawn to dusk. Gilgamesh follows this path, climbing the mountains, encountering the Scorpion Man and receiving permission from him to advance. Then he stops at a tavern that exists in this mysterious place, on this threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The innkeeper tries to persuade him to return, as his place was not there. Gilgamesh was still a living being and should enjoy his time in the world of the living, she argues. After much insistence from Gilgamesh, she relents and provides information on how he could overcome the next obstacle, the waters of death. To do this, he would have to find the boatman of the immortal man. Thus, he finds him, and finally reaches the abode of the immortal man, being able to ask him what the secret of immortality was. However, the answer he gets is not exactly the one he anticipated. The answer he receives in reality does not exactly constitute an answer in a more direct way, but rather a narrative. It is the story of the Great Flood. According to the immortal individual, named Utanapishtim, long ago, the gods decided to cleanse humanity from the face of the earth. However, one of the gods, known as Enki or Ea in the Akkadian language, chose to warn a human being about the imminent flood, allowing his family to survive the catastrophe and repopulate the earth later. This human being was precisely Utanapishtim, who followed Enki's instructions and built a gigantic vessel, according to the measurements provided by Enki himself. Inside this vessel he sheltered his own family and representatives of all forms of life. Then, the floodwaters came and devastated everything outside the vessel, and then the waters began to recede gradually. Observing this, Utanapishtim, who was stranded on the vessel atop a mountain, released some birds to determine if the waters had receded enough for them to leave. First, he released a dove, which returned. Next, he released a swallow, which also returned to the vessel. Then, he sent a raven, which did not return. Thus, he concluded that the waters had receded sufficiently. So he disembarked and offered a sacrifice to the gods on top of the mountain. The text mentions that the gods approached the offerings like flies. However, not all the gods were satisfied or at peace with Utanapishtim. Enlil, the main proponent of the flood, was outraged to discover that a human being, whom he intended to wipe off the face of the earth, had survived. So, he called a meeting with the gods to discuss Utanapishtim's fate. The decision reached was as follows. Due to the uniqueness of Utanapishtim's story and condition, he would be separated from humanity. From that moment on, he would become immortal, a characteristic exclusive to the gods, and would be forced to live far from other humans, on the banks of the river of death. In other words, Utanapishtim's immortality was not the result of his own merits or the use of secret techniques that Gilgamesh could imitate. Practically speaking, therefore, this story was completely useless for Gilgamesh's original goals, which were to seek immortality. He could not reproduce Utanapishtim's story and become immortal in the same way. However, before leaving completely frustrated so as not to return empty-handed, Utanapishtim's wife, who also became immortal, reveals to Gilgamesh that there is indeed a secret technique to maintain youth. Not for immortality exactly, but to restore vitality. This technique involves consuming a plant that grows in the depths of the waters of death. Gilgamesh could collect this plant on his journey back to the world of the living, and that's what he did. He set off with the boatman in search of this plant, dived into the waters of death and collected the plant. However, in a moment of distraction, a serpent appeared, swallowed the plant, and immediately regained its youth. The sign of this was that it left behind its old skin, and departed with new skin. So Gilgamesh resumed his journey back home, now even more frustrated than when he had talked to Utanapishtim. Finally, Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, the king returned to his kingdom, and the story ends with a rather open scene, subject to various interpretations. He, Gilgamesh, then began to relate to the boatman, the man who helped him cross the world of the dead, everything he had seen, everything he had learned, and also showed the boatman the beauty of the city of Uruk, its walls and the moat that surrounded it. Upon hearing all these details about the city, the boatman smiled and said to Gilgamesh, "Everything you are saying to me means nothing, for soon you will be reduced to dust. Everything you are telling me means nothing, for soon you will also become dust." And so the story ends exactly at that point, with Gilgamesh beginning to understand his place in the world, ephemeral and transitory, and that the glory of Uruk is also ephemeral and transitory. The city may be magnificent today, it may be one of the greatest centers of power in the world, but soon it will be reduced to dust. The story ends with this deeply philosophical and somber message, that everything in life is fleeting, that death is the great equalizer, and that in the end, we will all face the same condition. And with that, I end this video about the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you liked it, if you have something to add, feel free to comment below and leave your like. And that's it, until the next video.